Be sure to wear appropriate PPE when applying finish. In our class, and for this demonstration, this is the chemicals we're going to be spraying. It's a Sherwin-Williams product. It's their Sherwood high build product. It's got a UV blocker in there so your wood doesn't yellow or discolor over time from the UV light. It's a medium rub effect. It's a satin. And so this material is a catalyzed lacquer or a conversion lacquer. So the catalyzed lacquer allows it to dry very quickly. So it dries in about 10 to 15 minutes to the touch, and that allows you to flip it over and keep working with it and keep spraying it. One downside to the conversion lacquer is that once this pail is mixed with a catalyst, it's only good for about 4 months. So if you're not using a lot of it, then a bucket like this really wouldn't be beneficial. Here at the school, we're spraying quite a bit of lacquer, so we use several of these buckets a year, and so we're able to go through it fast enough where it doesn't start to set up and cure on us in the bucket. So in our facility, we've got our airless sprayer down under here with our clear coat in this bucket, and so this is where our machine sits to help keep the dust out of here. The doors are usually shut. We've got our bucket here, and before we start clear coating, we need to stir this. So we're going to pull it out of here. So I've got it pulled out. I'm going to pull this lid off, and you can see in here it should be this kind of creamy white color that we're seeing here when it's stirred appropriately. This looks pretty good. It hasn't been too long ago today that we used it, but it's not a bad idea to stir this before each use, and definitely each day if you're the first one in the class to use this. We want to make sure it's mixed nice and well so that when it dries correctly on your project. So when you're done mixing and stirring, go ahead and put the lid back on. Again, this keeps the dust from getting in, and so when coming up to our finish room to use it, by the stairs here we have lights for the finish room. That's these two white switches, and the one with the light here, that's the ventilation, so that indicates that it's on. The orange light indicates that it's on. This other switch powers up the lights upstairs on the mezzanine, so that's not a critical one, but these three switches when you're in the finish room should be on. Two lights and the ventilation. We're going to talk about spraying our finish on our projects. Now this material has already been prepped, it's been sanded, and all the pencil marks are off, any blemishes are removed. It's ready to go for a clear coat. We're doing this in our finish room. We have an exhaust fan over here that will take the fumes up and out, and then you can see we're working on a bench that's had all kinds of finish done on it, paint or lacquer, whatever it may be. So we've got our project ready to go. We've mixed our can of clear coat, and now we're going to look at the gun. The gun that we're going to be using is for the airless sprayer. It's going to spray out our material, and right now we're using a 1312 fan, or the spray, and the green indicates that it's a low pressure nozzle for us to use, so the pressure doesn't have to be as high as it does with the black and the blue nozzles. So we're going to go ahead and use this on our piece. When we're using it, what we want to do is we want to keep the gun as parallel to the surface as we're moving across. So my arm, my elbow, and my shoulder is what is moving. Okay, my wrist is not moving, it's kind of staying in place. If my wrist moves, then you can see we're going to lift up on the ends because my wrist is rocking back and forth. It's going to be making a U shape over that board. It's going to get thin on the ends and be heavy in the middle. We want a nice uniform coat, so we're going to keep it nice and parallel over the workpiece. Also, when I do this, I'm going to start before the workpiece. I'm going to turn the gun on. I'm going to spray all the way across and let it stop. I'm going to realign my gun, and then I'm going to come back across the workpiece. So I'm spraying the workpiece. My pattern should be overlapping about half or 50% as I'm spraying. So if I go down, you'll see, because the color will change in the wood, the dry wood versus the wet wood, and we'll show you the difference as we're doing this. Now with this lacquer that we're using, this Sherwin-Williams conversion lacquer, It will dry in about 10 to 15 minutes to the touch, and then we could flip it over and spray the other side. So that's one nice thing about this conversion lacquer. We're not going to be doing a spray can motion. Like if you had a can of spray paint, you'd go across that. This is going to start off the workpiece, go all the way across. We want a nice uniform coat. All right. As we're doing this, one thing you want to make sure is if this end or tip is not tight all the way, then sometimes lacquer will shoot out from around the loose spots there. Now this tip can turn, so you can see if I turn this to spray my pattern a different way, my pattern is going to be opposite this V. So if the V is this way, my fan blade would be out this way. If the V is up and down, then my fan blade is going to be sideways. So once you get that aligned, usually most of the time we just leave that upright, so the fan is going out like this in this pattern. And then if you want to change your direction, then you would just move your gun around rather than changing that pattern. But if you're doing this for long periods of time and you want to change that orientation, you could do that. So we're going to go ahead, we've got everything lined up. You want to make sure this is kind of making an arrow. It's going towards the front of the gun. If it's the other way, the spray pattern is not going to work. But sometimes we do turn that backwards like this, because if we get a little spot down here in the tip of lacquer that's in there, if we turn that around and blow it out the other way, then sometimes our fan stream, our pattern will be more precise. If you're spraying and the fan pattern isn't a nice even pattern, then that tip might have something clogging it, and you can turn that top nozzle around and spray it, and it's going to have a nice little stream. We wouldn't want to do this over the workpiece because then it's going to drip or spray a stream out, but you could aim it at something, scrap piece, so it can dry. It's going to be more of a straight direct spray when I have this nozzle turned backwards. You can see a nice straight shooting pattern versus a mist that will come out. So if we turn this around, we'll show you the right direction here, and you can see that there's kind of a fan pattern. Kind of sprays out, you know, a nice fan pattern when we spray that. So when you first pull the gun, one reason we want to be back off the workpiece is if this isn't tight and the lacquer squirts out around the edges because this has become loose, we don't want that to spray all over our workpiece, because then we're going to have droplets of lacquer. We want a nice clear spray pattern. So we want to maybe first time before we use it, make sure we're not pointing it at our workpiece. Pull the trigger, just make sure everything is coming out correctly. Point this in a safe direction towards the ventilation so it sucks those fumes out. And then once it appears to be working right, then we can take the gun and line it up. Again, our pattern is going to be about a 50% overlay as we're going over. Now, as we're putting this on, we can put too much on. If we put too much on, we're going to get runs. And if we take a look at the other side of this board, I have some runs that were created here. And I don't know if you'll be able to see them real well in the camera, but right in here is some heavy spots where the material has run, the lacquer has run. Right there, you can see it really well. So if we get too heavy, then we have the chance of material running. So we don't want to get too heavy, because not only will it run, but also we can get spots that look really heavy and thick and spots that are lighter. Now, the lacquer, like glue, is a pain in the butt to get off. So if you get heavy spots, that means we're going to have to take sandpaper and probably sand this down to the bare wood again in order to get those runs to disappear and not be seen. So we got to be careful not to get the runs. One thing that we can do to help prevent us from getting runs is to spray our material flat. So if I lay this material flat on the surface and I spray this a little heavy, there's nowhere for it to run. If I were to lean this up against the wall and then spray it and it gets heavy, then gravity is going to pull all that extra lacquer down the board. So one thing you want to be careful for is to try to keep your pieces as flat as possible when spraying. And then generally we spray with the grain. So if my pattern is coming out in a fan pattern like this, then I would want to move forward and back. If my fan pattern was coming out sideways, then I could turn this workpiece so that I'm spraying with the grain. So as we're putting the clear coat on, we don't want to get it heavy. I would rather have you put 10 light coats of clear coat on than one heavy. You can always add more, but once you put too much on, it is very difficult and a pain in the butt to get off and to make it look and blend when you're done. So 10 light coats is much better than one heavy. As we're doing this, as we're taking our gun across the workpiece, we need to have kind of a fast motion. We don't want to linger in one spot too long. We want to have a continuous flow. So let's take a look. I'm going to start the gun here. I'm going to turn it on, and I'm going to go past my workpiece. Now you can see where I have sprayed. So I want to overlap about 50% of my spray pattern. So I would come and line this up. Now generally you wouldn't remove your arm around, you would just come back and go back and forth. But since I stopped and we're talking about it, I'm going to start down here again. I'm going to line up about 50% and I'm going to spray that again. Then I would reposition and I'd come back. And I would come back over and I would go again right up to the edge. Now if you have a spot that looks like maybe you didn't get so much, like right here in the middle, it looks like maybe I didn't get enough lacquer on there. I don't want to hit that now. I don't want to put too much clear coat on right now. If I try to hit that again, I might have it puddle up. So I'll wait till this layer dries and then I can add more clear coat. One area that you don't want to neglect is the edges of your boards. Now when we're spraying smaller pieces like this, for example, one thing I like to do when spraying is maybe hold the gun at a slight angle. This way, as I spray down, I can get some clear coat on this edge of this board as well. And then as I come back, I'm going to turn my gun the other direction and try to get clear coat on that side. So I would come down and back, and down and back, down and back at an angle. That's going to allow it to get clear coat on each side. And again, you need to be kind of quick with your movements because we don't want to get excess clear coat in one spot or another. When you're done spraying, the gun has a little hook on top. We need to hang this gun. There's a little wire in here so that it doesn't fall and hit the floor. These guns are kind of expensive. If you're going to come back and spray clear coat later, this would be a good option. If we're at the end of the day and the gun's not going to be used anymore for a while, then we want to put it in this can. This can is lacquer thinner, and so we would put it in here and let it sit overnight. That way it keeps the tip nice and clean so it's not clogged up the next day. So if you were to come in for the first time, you want to pull this out and you want to let all that lacquer that's dripping off the gun drip on its own. So we're going to just let it hang maybe from here or back up on this wire and let that drip off as we're prepping our materials. If I try to spray with this gun dripping some of this lacquer, it's going to drip that lacquer on my workpiece, and then as I spray, it's going to make a discoloration in my clear coat. So I don't want to spray while the gun is dripping anything. Even if it's lacquer or if it's a lacquer thinner, we don't want to have that dripping on our project as we're clear coating. When we're done spraying, if there's a lot of people that are needing to get in here, if everybody's working on the same project, we can move your pieces over to the rack over there and let them dry. That way other people can come in here and work. Because if another student puts their project down right here and starts clear coating on it, they're going to get overspray onto your project. And so that's not good because it's going to feel really fuzzy then with that overspray that sits and settles on there. So we really don't want your project left in this spray area. We would want to move it off over into the storage rack. So when you think it's dry, it looks dry. Again, you're touching the bench to feel. Now this feels tacky still. It's not sticking to my fingers, but I can feel that my fingers are sticking to the workbench a little bit, so it's not quite ready. We talked about making sure when you flip your material over or when you're spraying that you make sure it's dry by touching the bench and making sure it's not sticky. Here's an example of what can happen if you flip your pieces over too early and that clear coat's not all the way dry, or you set it down somewhere, maybe this hasn't even been sprayed yet, but I set it down into some wet clear coat and this board is stuck to my piece. And so that's going to do a couple things. It's going to put blemishes in the finish. It may rip out or tear out some of the wood. You can see on this board there's some pieces of wood that have been stuck to that. So a variety of things can happen when you flip your pieces too early or if you set them down into a wet clear coat. Here's another piece that was stuck to a piece of wood, and not only sticking, but you can see part of the material of the board it was stuck to has torn out. Maybe dried clear coat has torn a little bit. And so you're going to get some disfiguration in your material if you're flipping it over and setting it down before it's dry. Here's our piece we just sprayed. I pulled it out of the finish room. We're going to sand it now. Now what happens is we get this wet from the clear coat. The fibers of the wood want to kind of stand up a little bit. So now we need to come in and knock down the grain that is stood up. And so we're going to use some sandpaper. Between each coat, we typically sand with some sandpaper. This is a 400 grit. I would go anywhere from that 320 upward. 320 to 600 grit you could use to do this. 400 is relatively a good grit. It's going to create very small scratches that the next layer of clear coat will then fill in. You won't see any scratches, of course, unless you sand against the grain. So when we're doing this, we're always sanding with the grain. So this is the side I just sprayed, and it feels kind of fuzzy. Some from overspray and some from those fibers of the wood standing up. So I'm literally taking the sandpaper and rubbing down the workpiece. I am not trying to sand off that clear coat. I'm just trying to knock down those fibers so that my next layer of clear coat is smooth. So I'm just kind of giving it a rub down with the sandpaper, sanding with the grain. Okay. My sandpaper doesn't look too clogged up. If this clear coat was still really wet, then I would have big splotches where the clear coat has gummed up the sandpaper. But overall, from that sanding, it doesn't look too bad. It's nice and smooth to the touch. So now I could wipe off any dust, blow it off with an air hose, and then re-clear coat this project. So when we're clear coating, we at least want 2 coats. The first coat, it's going to stand up that grain. We're going to knock it down. And then the second coat's going to go over, maybe hit any spots that you missed. We have this spot here that doesn't have a lot of clear coat on there. We can get that with our second coat. We sand in between our coats to knock that down for a nice smooth finish. One thing I told you about in the finish room was to watch those edges. As we look across the edge here, we're looking for any dry spots. This is a spot that is often missed. And one reason it absorbs more clear coat than others because the end grain of the wood, right, the grain is across the grain here, this absorbs more wood. It's more porous. It's going to soak that material in, or that clear coat. So that might be why it looks a little bit more dry. So it might take an extra coat or two to get this to look nice and wet all the way down. Let's take a look at the other side. And this side here, we can definitely see there is some dry spots. You can see this radius looks like it's got clear coat, and then from my finger over to the edge here, it looks pretty dry. We can see some of that grain in there. And so this is where we would want to spray that again, watching those edges. And again, we really see this on the end grain of the wood. That's where those dry edges exist. All right, so when it comes to dealing with things like the runs that we have in this board, there's not really a good way to get those to disappear. So right now, if we take the orbital sander, because this is still kind of not set or cured, it's dry to the touch, but it's still soft. My orbital sander is going to heat up and kind of blend that and kind of smear it around, and it's not going to look real pretty. So when we talked about sanding too early, when the clear coat's still soft, you can kind of see this little pattern right in here. And it's hard to see on the camera, but this clear coat has kind of smudged a little bit because it was soft when we tried to sand it. Now, I don't know how well you can see that in the camera, but that's one thing we want to avoid, is make sure the clear coat is nice and dry before we start to sand it, especially with the orbital sander. You can see inside this red circle where the sander has heated up that soft clear coat and smeared it around. So if we sand, we're going to have to sand a large area all the way down to the bare wood surface to get those runs to blend in. So on our board, we have these spots of clear coat, and if we look here, there's a little ridge right along this edge that's built up kind of thick. I believe you can see it in the camera, that little high ridge right there. And that's where we can take a utility blade knife or a flat blade, razor blade, and just kind of lay it flat along the surface and peel up that high ridge. Now, this may help with blending and it may not. You might still have to sand this area to get rid of that, but you can see it's starting to cut off some of this thick, gooey, excessive clear coat. And you can do that as well out with these ones in the middle of the board. You can just lay that razor blade nice and flat and kind of push it with your fingers. Just make sure you're not cutting yourself, you're keeping yourself a safe distance away from that sharp edge. You don't want to dig in too much, you want to lay it as flat as possible. If you're more upright, it's going to cut down into the wood. If the clear coat's a little bit more dry, one thing you could do is take the razor blade and try scraping with it. So we're going to keep that razor pretty vertical and just drag it across the surface to knock down those high spots. And you can see it starts to accumulate on the bottom of the razor blade. These methods for removing the runs, it's not going to look as good as if you take this project and put the right amount of clear coat on in the first place. So trying to fix these runs is probably always going to create some blemish in the wood that we're not going to be able to 100% get rid of. So that's why it's important to apply the appropriate amount the first time when spraying your wood. You can take a project and you could have two identical projects next to each other, and they're built to the same quality, they're built to the same standards, and one of them has a really good finish and the other one has a finish with lots of runs. Maybe it wasn't sanded very good. And so that really can make a difference in breaking a project or making it look outstanding, is the sanding and finishing. So the building of the project is probably only about 50% of the work. Then you've got to sand, you got to prep for finish, you got to sand between coats, and then when you're all done, put all your hardware and stuff on. One thing when spraying the lacquer, we're spraying it and we're putting this fine powdery mist of flammable material into the air. So we need to be careful in the finish room that we're not using things that can cause a spark. So a cordless drill, your cell phone going off could create a spark that could ignite the fumes in the finish room. So we need to be careful with these flammable materials and anything that could set off or ignite that. So we're back in the finish room, we've sanded our surface, we've knocked down those wood fibers that are standing up, and now we're ready to put our second coat on. So we're going to get our gun and we're going to do the same process. Now, one thing I might consider doing is, if you sprayed it this direction last time, maybe turn your board around. So that way, as you're going around the edges and around the sides, you're getting all of the surfaces. Same process as before, we're going to overlap our pattern about 50%. Now, we're not going to be able to identify where we've sprayed and not sprayed as easy because the wood now has that wet look from the clear coat. We'll still be able to see a shininess from the wet lacquer, but it's not going to be as noticeable as it was the first coat. So let's take our gun and spray again. Okay, and then maybe go around the edges and get those edges so that they're all cleaned up. Now again, we're gonna let this sit another 10 or 15 minutes. If it feels nice and smooth when we're done, we can be done. If not, if somebody next to us has sprayed their project and we got overspray and other things in there, we may have to sand it and repeat the process, or just sand it smooth after the last coat. Now we'd let this dry in here 10 to 15 minutes. In order to tell if it is done, you want to touch the workpiece around there. So my bench, I want to touch that. If that is sticky, then my workpiece is going to be sticky. If I touch this while it's sticky, I'm going to get fingerprints in there. So I don't want to touch that. Always testing if the clear coat is dry by touching the workbench. A couple other things we want to watch for when we're clear coating is the overspray. When we're spraying, the stuff that doesn't stick to our project builds up. We can see some of that over here on this door. Here is some lacquer that has built up over time. It's kind of a fine powdery dust. This is overspray. Now that overspray, if we're blowing on top of a piece of wood that has a lot of overspray, that overspray can kick back up and get into our workpiece. So if we're spraying a big project in here, I would not set it directly on the floor because there's a lot of dust on the floor from the wood shop and from the overspray. And if you start laying things on the floor and spraying them, it's going to kick up that overspray off of the floor and bring it into your workpiece. We've got this little bench over here, and again, you can see some of this overspray that's on the table, like little flakes of stuff, little sawdust. And if I were to have my workpiece behind that and spray, the movement of that flow would take and pick this stuff up and bring it into my clear coat. So we want to make sure that all this is cleaned off, or that you're spraying in a spot that does not have any overspray or stuff that's going to be picked up and brought into your clear coat. If you have any questions with spraying lacquer, spraying your boards, any of the finishing process, please talk to your instructor and they'll get you the help you need.